Good evening and welcome to the 2023 budget analysis. We are here with you. The Prime Minister has presented her budget for this year, and we're going to be analyzing it with a special panel. We have the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Board for the Undergraduate Studies at the University of the West Indies, Professor Justin Robinson. We have Economist, Dr. Justin Ram, and political analyst Peter Wickham. I want to welcome all three of you gentlemen for joining our panel this evening to do this analysis. And I also want to welcome you, our viewers, for staying with us after the budget delivery to hear just what will be said. Now, gentlemen, if I can have your views on the presentation, general views, and I will begin with you, Dr. Ram.
Okay, thank you, Ms. President. Good evening to my general thoughts on the budget. I would say it's fairly positive in the sense that I think that the population would be relieved that there are no new taxes. There also seems to be considerable relief being given to the population in terms of perhaps welfare payments, and in terms of increases in salaries, which we knew were announced a few weeks ago, but again reconfirmed in the budget. And of course, with respect to other measures around trying to build social capital, for example. But I would say that in my mind, the most promising thing that I've heard in the budget this afternoon from the Prime Minister was her focus on growth, an area that I think that the Barbados economy has been particularly lagging behind. So I was very pleased to hear about the initiatives around the new National Growth Council, which will be headed by the chair of SAGICOR, Doddridge Miller, as well as there's a subcommittee called Barbados Delivers. I thought that these were really, really important initiatives for the Prime Minister to outline.
Okay.
And what is left on these initiatives.
Okay, I'll go next to you, Peter Wickham.
Hey, yeah, Wendy, thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel. I too thought the budget was relatively decent, and against the background of what I said earlier in terms of national expectations, I think one of the major ones would have been that there are no new taxes, and I think that people will be happy, certainly, and relieved to hear that. Some of the other issues which were raised during the course of the day in terms of expectations, the question of tax relief, well, not tax relief, the question of relief for pensioners who were hoping for an increase, has been to some extent addressed in relation to the tax relief given to some of those pensioners who would have been, I think it is from 40 to 45,000. So there is some relief there in respect of one of those issues. And the other thing was the mention of the water situation, taxation on water or the water fees that were related to water and sewage. That, in a sense, has been also dealt with to the extent that persons who have debts to the BWA and the QEH will be given some 25% relief, but that has been more or less left as it is. So I would say that in terms of the additional take, there's a satisfaction that there has been nothing more, but I believe there will be some disappointment in some circles regarding some of the other issues that weren't dealt with in terms of the relief being offered. Presumably, relief will be offered later. But there clearly is, this was a budget that was more or less intended to stabilize and to speak to government's policy going forward. Like Justin, I'm happy that we're hearing of some major initiatives that are likely to start. The fact that we've broken ground on a new hospital. I mean, we do need a few major construction projects to get the economy going, and it's good to hear that these things will be happening in fairly short order, so that's also a relief. On a more global sense, though, I'm comfortable with the fact that the budget presented what is essentially a 7-year plan, and it takes me back to the days of Owen Arthur's policy statements, which he attempted to suggest would replace the budget. And we are hearing essentially what is a tidy 7-year plan that's being rolled out in relation to Barbados. And the Prime Minister she's spoken to it, she's repeated it on several occasions, and today she has again reiterated the fact that this budget is just one small component of a longer plan that they have for Barbados in terms of development, and one that we can wrap our minds around.
Okay.
So I would say that there was some relief, a bit of disappointment, but generally the package was one that I believe we can engage respectively over the next few days.
And what about you, Professor Robinson? What's your general take?
Okay, so again, thanks and good evening. So in the build-up to the budget, I was asked what I saw as the priorities and what I was looking for. So one I highlighted was what was the growth strategy for Barbados? Because I think people have heard me say ad nauseum that when I look at the data from 1961 to 2022, the economy has grown by about a cumulative 112%. But 3/4 of that happened between 1961 and 1973. And my view is that we sort of got stuck with that tourism model and we were looking for a new catalyst for growth. And we saw the Prime Minister lay out some of those possible new sectors, new areas to take us on a new growth trajectory. I think the danger in the futuristic style is that persons can come away from it feeling, okay, nice sounding initiatives, but a bit short on detail about that aspect. But there's also a clear shorter term strategy of stimulating growth through the capital works program. So we saw quite a few initiatives there. And I think once those projects can be executed in a timely manner, we will benefit from some growth around that capital works program. As I said, there wasn't really that much detail on the others, which are futuristic, but could be very important.
Okay.
We are into the second IMF program, and the heart of that in many ways, our key plank, is the reform of the SOEs. That was mentioned, but we didn't get a lot more specifics on that. So I thought that was missing to some extent. And thirdly, the domestic financing, because in the estimates, there is about 200 or so million of domestic financing that it seems uncertain. And those investors have not come back in the market post the debt restructuring. The Prime Minister seemed to, well, she offered some incentives really to get persons back into the domestic market. So it'd be interesting to see how effective that is in achieving that objective, so the government doesn't face cash flow problems because of an absence of domestic financing.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to look at the fact that Barbados's foreign reserves are strong. And we will also come back, Professor Robinson, to the point you're making about getting those investors back into this market. We'll be back with our analysis after the break. And we're back with the 2023 budget analysis. We have with us Professor Justin Robinson, Dr. Justin Ram, and Peter Wickham. Now, the Prime Minister let the country know that Barbados and its foreign reserves are in a very sound place. In fact, we're at 2.99 billion and on the verge of reaching 3. Let's go to the Prime Minister.
Over 3.2 billion almost for the first time ever in this country's history. And for those who say some of it is borrowed, think of all of the countries in the world that could not borrow a cent in the last 3 years because of a lack of confidence in the management of their affairs at a time when Barbados came in with only 4 weeks.
Now, we're talking about where we are in terms of our reserves. Now, when we look at that and we think about going into a BERT 2, etc., are we on target, Professor Robinson, for being able to service our debt well, given all the measures that would have been announced today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is a clear yes. I think the government has exercised a fair degree of fiscal discipline, and their spending plans have been guided by that metric of getting to a debt to GDP ratio of 60%. But I think it's 2036 now, Ram?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, somewhere in that vicinity. So I don't think that is an issue at this point. And we have a lot of discussion around that issue, but debt sustainability doesn't imply or doesn't mean balanced budgets or no borrowing, but it's a level of borrowing that you can service. So I don't see that as a challenge for the Barbados economy at this juncture.
Okay. We also had a situation where we spoke about the workers, the temporary workers out of the ashfall, and this 1,500 that's going to be coming to a number of them. Is this a measure that most of you all are comfortable with? I mean, yes, the jobs are no longer going to be there, and she mentioned a major budget to continue training for those workers who would soon be on the breadline. What's your take on that, Professor Ram? Dr. Ram, sorry.
Well, before I come to that, just to get back to the debt numbers, the Prime Minister did also say today that she will be repaying some existing bondholders, and think individuals, about 5,400 bondholders will be receiving payments on their principal almost immediately. Some of them, I think, will be paid out in full. So again, that says that with respect to paying down debt, that the government and the country is on the right track, and so that seems to be no longer a major issue. So we seem as if we have come out of the darkest period that we were in, I would say maybe about five years ago. Now, with respect to workers receiving payments, I think it's all in line with the Prime Minister's short-term goal of trying to boost growth in the short term by providing workers with some extra money in their pockets, which they can then utilize within the economy. And then, of course, that can have some multiplier effects. However, I just really want to say something about that. One of the issues, of course, we have in Barbados, and I think not only in Barbados, but a lot of the other Caribbean countries, is that we are still very much dependent on imports. And so when people receive money in their pockets, they would certainly go out to the supermarket, or perhaps the shops to buy things. But a lot of that money is purchasing imports. And I'm not certain what level of multiplier effect that's going to have on the economy. The Prime Minister did mention today something about trying to improve food security, and even going beyond that of trying to export some produce as well. I think that there needs to be a sort of a holistic picture around this if we are going to see short-term growth translated into sustainable medium and longer-term growth that I think the Barbados economy urgently needs now.
Okay. Now, on that point, Dr. Ram, the said imports are also helping to drive the inflation, and that's something we spoke to earlier today, Peter. The level of inflation and the fact that, you know, because you were not redeeming as much confidence in the agricultural sector in terms of being able to deal with some of those imports.
So you're asking me or Justin?
Yes, I'm talking to you now, Peter.
Right,
Yes.
right. Yeah, and I remain unconvinced. It's nice to talk about the agricultural sector being able to pick up the slack, but I think that experience has taught us that it's likely to be a slightly different situation. You know, Justin's concerns regarding the extent to which a lot of that $1,500 will go outside is a problem in an economy like Barbados. But as I see the foreign reserve situation as being a relatively comfortable one, so I guess that she's less concerned about it. My take on the 1,500, you know, I think is part of a political strategy. Government had attempted to essentially slim down the public service, and just to do that consistent with the IMF strategy. They ran into some problems in terms of the ashfall, in terms of COVID, and also in terms of you know, the other short-term issues. And those were taken on to help deal with some of those challenges. Government now has to release them in a way that appears politically. And I think that the idea of giving them a $1,500 gratuity in a situation where they were not necessarily such is kind of a good parting gift and a good way of essentially cushioning the political fallout. They want to be involved. Presumably, they believe that they can manage it in the scheme of things. And look, I am not concerned about the idea of persons who are employed in that wouldn't work now, because the sense I get from the budget is that there is ample work to go around. You know, government has announced essentially in that budget, they announced a couple of projects, major construction projects, and a few to follow. And my sense is that these are people who will be able to be easily absorbed in the scheme of things. So at the $1,500, as I said, is a good political trade-off to help cushion the impact. But I think that ultimately is something that we can manage going forward.
Okay, and I want to go back to the Prime Minister now on two areas that we spoke to. The payment of the bonds, which Dr. Ram spoke to. It is actually going to be a payment of $74.8 million to those Series B holders. So let's go now to that extract.
A payment of $17,500 each. Mr. Speaker, we took no pride in having to give those persons Series B bonds when we inherited the difficult moment that caused us to go in debt restructuring. But we said then, even as we prepared some of the pensioners in 2018 and 19, that we will do right by you. And today we stand now, sir. Of that 5,407 persons, 2,627 of them are being repaid absolutely in full.
Right, gentlemen. And before we get back to your commentary, I also want to air that extract concerning those workers who are getting that $1,500.
That $1,500 ain't only going to the people who work in the public service, but there were people who came in as ash workers at the Ministry of Public Works and at the People National Housing Corporation and in all those jobs during COVID. And the $1,500 represents our thank you. I wish I could do more. I feel you feel it, just like me. I wish I could do more. But I know that I'm doing right, both with the prepayment of this debt and using the surplus that we have beyond our targets this year to do one, reduce our debt. Two, to be able to boost industrial productivity by showing our workers that we care about them. Three, to be able to put something one side next week for capital formation for the projects that we have to build out to make sure that those workers who are now going home can find jobs at places like the geriatric hospital that the Senior Minister of Health broke ground yesterday for me in the Botanical Gardens for yesterday. 104 million, I think it is. over the next 18 to 20 months, and other capital projects that we will vote for next week out of this year's estimates and not next year's.
There we heard it, Professor Robinson. Is what was presented today going to do all that she envisages?
Okay, so I mean, are you asking me about the debt restructuring element there?
Yes, in terms of the targets that she says she intends to meet. Well,
the debt restructuring has been one of, in some ways, the more controversial aspects of this administration. I mean, Barbados has had to go through difficult adjustments before. We went to the IMF in 1981. We would have gone again on the Sandy Flood and then 2018. And in the previous restructurings or fiscal adjustments in Barbados, the public service would have borne the brunt of that adjustment. You know, you had the famous 8% cut, layoffs, taxes, and so on. One of the big differences in 2018 is that creditors, bondholders, bore a lion's share of the adjustment. And that has really lingered around in Barbados. I think a number of bondholders have remained raw about it. And I think that sentiment has been lingering. Much more troubling than the personal sentiment, and maybe much more important, is the willingness of the of the financial institutions to return to the market. I mean, history shows when we look at other countries around the world, you tend to have the bond market come back within 4 years. You know, Jamaica has had a debt restructuring, Grenada has had a debt restructuring, and we have seen their domestic investors come back in a major way in a relatively short space of time. But we haven't seen that appetite at all in Barbados since the government has gone back into the market. And I think that's a very interesting issue, maybe interesting to me as a finance person, because while the government seems to command the confidence of the international financial institutions who are quite confident to provide significant amounts of loans, it seems to be having a challenge in getting back the domestic. So I see the payout as a way of maybe trying to begin to heal that wound with the domestic investors. Now, critical for the financing of government is what the institutional investors do. They are the lion's share of the market. I still think it's one of the open questions going into the financial year, whether they come back in sufficient quantities so that the government doesn't face a financing challenge, at least on the domestic side, because for the last 5 years, the vast majority of financing has been foreign financing.
Maybe I can get Dr. Ram to weigh in here in terms of what can be done to lure more domestic investment.
Well, I think there are a number of touch points that we need to look at. The Prime Minister did mention, I heard it quite briefly, about the stimulation of the secondary market and to encourage more retail investors, that is to say, who would come in and purchase local debt. But I think, as Dr. Robinson was saying, or Professor Robinson was just saying, that we have an issue here where institutional investors are still quite shy about wanting to hold on to Barbados. And that is for a number of reasons, not only because they would have received a haircut back in 2018 or 2019, but the mere fact that the credit rating of Barbados is still not at investment grade as yet would also be a cause of concern for them, because it would mean that they would have to hold maybe quite a lot of capital against those types of investments. So again, I think what we're going to have to do is that we cannot get away from the pressing issue of the day, which is that we need to focus on getting growth back into this economy, which in effect will trigger a renewal of confidence not only by investors, but also by consumers as well. And I think that has to be the priority now. And I think really when I spoke about earlier, when I heard about the Prime Minister's initiative around that National Growth Council, as it were, I thought that that was really good. Again, the proof is in the pudding. What are they going to come up with? Because we know, for example, in Jamaica, over the last decade or so, they had a National Growth Council as well, which attempted to have 5% growth rate in 5 years. And if I'm not mistaken, they failed at it. What are the lessons that we can learn from Jamaica and perhaps we can learn and implement here in Barbados now? So I think before all of this, trying to encourage investors to get back into the debt market, we really have to focus on rejuvenating growth in the domestic economy as job number one.
Okay, if I can have Peter weigh in here on that whole issue of economic growth. What were some of the elements within the budget, some of the other elements that you saw being best fits and most suitable to help stimulate that growth?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do like the announcement of major projects. Justin Robinson, Professor Robinson will remember well that when we had the last, one could say, boom, it was at a point in time when, there was major construction going on in Barbados, and that seems to be a link in Barbados. So whenever there's an announcement of major construction projects, I think that is one. There's some other hidden elements in there to mention of the alternative energy sector and, initiatives to help people, encourage people to buy, vehicles, electric vehicles. There was also an initiative in there in relation to the public service vehicles, although the quantity of money doesn't seem to be a lot, but that seems to be an area that the Prime Minister is looking to, where you can have some kind of growth in terms of this sector, which is relatively new. The film industry seems to have gotten some assistance, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that it appears as though the Prime Minister is identifying this as an industry that can grow, the cultural industry. I think there were a couple of initiatives in there in relation to other aspects of culture too. One of the churches, I think, got some funds and support to help to build out one of their initiatives in terms of culture. So I think that is the type of thing we could say that there's a service industry approach to it to get some level of growth going there. But it definitely focuses heavily on building and construction, and then, as I said, there's some nice alternative ideas that seem to be emerging. I think the agriculture is mentioned there in relation to some initiatives as well, but my feeling is that that's not a major part of it.
Okay. Now, one of the things that Prime Minister Motley also addressed is the burden which consumers are feeling within the banking sector, and she spoke to the high cost of commercial bank fees. Let's hear the Prime Minister.
This salary increase and the salary payment of $1,500 per person, plus this is not the first time we're addressing it. This has made it difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to access affordable financing, hindering their growth and development. Lowering these fees we have believed to be essential to our journey to support growth of businesses and generally the overall economy. We know that the banks changed their business model. And I'm not here to vilify the banks, but I'm here to say to you that there are certain things that we really can't carry, because they not only act as an instrument of tyranny to households, but also as an economic disincentive and a disincentive to competitiveness for enterprises.
Professor Robinson, do you see it as a disincentive?
Okay, so this has also been an ongoing issue. There is a view that the commercial banks have shifted their business model and are relying more heavily on fees as distinct from loans. And at the risk of sounding like if the Justins met before, I think one of the underlying issues here is growth. I guess I struggle with the idea that a bank a profit-oriented bank is not going to make loans that it can make money on. I struggle with that idea that they're going to turn away profitable business. That doesn't make sense to me. But if we don't have a growing economy and if you have the economy flat, then it seems to me that I would expect that there would be weak loan demand to go along with that if there isn't that lack of, if there isn't that confidence. So in that context, I don't find it surprising that fees can become a more important part of your income as you try to maintain your profitability. And my own set, so I understand the push, and as a bank, as a regulator and others, that is an issue. We don't want anti-competitive behavior, unnecessary burdens. But I think the loans and the loans becoming important to the institutions, I think if we get the growth and then you get that loan demand, I think again you can solve that problem.
Okay. If I can have your take on it first, Peter, and then Dr. Rams.
Yeah. No, the issue of bank fees is one that has bothered a number of ordinary Barbadians for a long time. Some people have shifted to the credit unions, but I think that still we find that a lot of the bank's behavior is, in a sense, it's offensive to be adding fees. It's something that the average Barbadian is bothered by. As we move more and more into this kind of economy where the idea of electronic commerce and so on is mandatory, you're encouraged to transfer money instead of writing checks or use cash. We can't avoid working with banks. And I think that an important part of that statement is essentially a shot across the bow to banks that, look, the central bank will use its power to exercise some level of control and regulation over the types of fees that banks have been charging. And I do think that many Barbadians feel that government has not been aggressive enough in using the central bank to send a signal and I say this with just due respect to you, Professor Robinson, as a former or current director of the central bank. So the fact that she makes a statement like this essentially tells us that at least there is some attention being paid to bank fees, and hopefully there's more of that to come, because it is something that bothers the ordinary Barbadian. The actual effect of that initiative, I don't know that it will make a huge difference, but I do feel that it is a signal, and it's something that will placate the concerns of a number of people that, we're not getting anywhere with banks on these fees, and they are excessive. They seem to be multiplying, and as the service diminishes in terms of the bank's ability to offer services, I mean to even answer a simple telephone call, but yet still we're having all of these fees thrown on top of us, and I think it's a signal that government is watching and is concerned. Okay,
Dr. Rapp.
Well, I think simply it comes back to the point around growth, because if there is a bank operating in Barbados now and would like to grow its loan portfolio, that's actually quite risky to do when the economy is not growing at the level at a sustainably strong level. It means that you have certain risk in there that perhaps persons could lose their jobs or businesses can go out of business, and therefore you have a higher ratio of non-performing loans on your books, and then you have to put capital against that. So part of this, of course, has to deal with the regulatory environment with which banks have to operate. And they are rightfully quite strict because we don't want banks to fail. In the US now, we are seeing banks failing because they did not have strict regulations on them. I think that the authorities are doing the right things by keeping banks in a sort of a straitjacket and saying to them that if you're going to lend, you need to be lending in a wise fashion. Now, if you're trying to do that in an economy that's not growing, it's going to be very, very risky. And so banks obviously will try to find other ways to earn income, as Professor Robinson has said. So I think we have to start thinking about this differently as well. Perhaps we have to also consider what other types of financial intermediaries we can consider to have within our financial sector that would be more willing to lend and to invest without the constraints that banks that are deposit holders have currently. So I think there needs to be a much bigger conversation around this. And what I'm really hoping for is that within that National Growth Council, within that sub council of Barbados Delivers, that some of these big issues around access to credit would also be looked at as well. Because at the moment, banks have no alternatives than to charge higher fees if they want to make a profit, because there aren't any other real avenues to make more money, simply because the economy is not growing. And so this type of discussion is really important, but we really have to look at it from a more holistic point of view as well.
Okay, I want to
Wendy,
take
I
you
think that's
up,
a really
Professor.
important
Yes,
point that Ram is making
yes.
in terms of the banking sector is ripe for disruption with some fintech type services, and that could be an important area of growth. And a way of addressing this problem that so vexes Peter.
Yeah, just to add on that, in all of that, Wendy, the unit trust initiative, I think it's important that we mention that in the context of that conversation, because that's new,
Yes.
and I
The
think
trust.
it's consistent with the type
The
of
trust
thing
funds.
that Justin has been talking about. Yeah, the idea of having not only trust funds, I think it's the unit approach, or the idea of being able to invest in units, right, is a kind of a bite-sized way for people to invest small sums of money in a relatively controlled environment. So something to think about as well.
Okay, let's look at some of the social policies and some of the people that are being helped. Outside of the new district hospital, the geriatric hospital that we're going to be building, we are also looking to put some more money into community care for elderly and a number of other programs. Do you think that enough was given in terms of the social sphere back to those who helped to build this economy over the years? I'll start with you, Peter.
Yeah, well, that geriatric hospital is a major investment. I think the minister said it's something like $100 million over a period of time. I would say that is a considerable investment into the elderly and aging. I think, in a sense, it helps the government in two ways. One is that it helps to tidy up the whole question of elderly care, but it also helps in the sense that it will ease some of the burden on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital that's forced to deal with a lot of these patients. So I think there's a win-win, and I think it's a significant investment into the elderly care. We also have the community nursing program, or the community care program, which has also been reinforced. I think initially it was started out as a slightly more short-term. Maybe some of the persons in those programs can now have longer term employment and slightly more structured employment contributions to NIS and whatnot. And I think they'll be happy about that. But yes, I think that this is definitely a signal that government is looking to deal more effectively with the elderly, both at the level of the community in terms of persons coming in, and also at the level of the nation in terms of having a new geriatric hospital. And yes, I am excited about the prospect of a major hotel investment in the place where the geriatric hospital was. I think that it would be a far more productive use of that site in terms of generating foreign exchange for tourism purposes. I was keen on knowing whether or not the government headquarters will be part of it, but I think it's fairly clear from what the Prime Minister said that short of looking to move government headquarters out, the idea is to expand government headquarters footprint, and it would be interesting to see how that will share the space with the major tourism investment next door.
Okay, because I believe it's going to be used for conference facilities more so, so that we can actually get into that captive market. Now, one of the other things that Barbadians have been dealing with for some time is the cost of fuel. And we've gotten that VAT cap on fuel effective as of April 1st. The gasoline is going to be capped at 47 cents for that 6-month period. What are your thoughts on this cap? Anyone can take it.
Let one of the economists.
Well, I have to say that generally, as an economist, I'm not for subsidies. I would much prefer see people having jobs that pay them well, so that they can afford to make the decisions on their own. However, we are living in very strange times, where we have a number of crises around us. I think people speak about a multi-crisis type situation now. And one of those really has been around the high levels of inflation, as some of my other presenters have said, have really been imported. And so, although I'm not really against the subsidy, I'm not really for subsidies. I do understand why the government really wanted to try to shield the pocketbooks and the wallets of the ordinary citizen, and so I don't have much arguments against this. However, I do want to say that again, we have to start thinking about how we are going to be paying all of these bills that eventually are going to come due, and whether we are continuously going to try to provide support to residents and citizens every time there is a crisis. I don't think that that's the right approach. And again, I think that we have to consider how we build up resilience from the individual to the household and then ultimately to the community and to the country, starting from the bottom up. What it is that we need to do and what is the vision for us there so that individuals can be self-resilient, as it were, without having to always rely on government interventions, which ultimately lead us to a bill that we have to either pay now or later on as we have to pay down our debts. So
Okay.
coming back again to the point around the initiatives around welfare and the provision of the new hospital, one of my major concerns around that is how do we eventually pay for this? We know that we have an aging population. The Prime Minister also mentioned today around the high levels of NCDs within our community, particularly with respect to diabetes. All of these things are going to lead to higher health costs. And are we having those discussions today about how we are going to be paying for these in the future? Or in fact, how do we reduce the incidence of these NCDs? So again, I think we have to have this conversation that's very much holistic, as it were. And again, I just have to repeat this mantra that it's going to be a lot easier for us to deal with these issues around providing good health services, providing welfare payments, providing, if we have to, some subsidies, growth within our economy. And I cannot emphasize enough how important that is for us to focus on again.
Okay, I'm glad you started to speak about how are we going to pay the debt. And the Prime Minister spoke to the 70 million that government pays per annum for rent at buildings in various places to house different government departments, etc. And she pointed to having more public-private partnerships in terms of dealing with this. Peter, Dr. Robinson, Professor Robinson, do you think this is the way to go to help deal with those particular bills?
Okay, so when I look at the structure of public expenditure in Barbados, I think the reforms of the SOEs and the types of things you're talking about are extremely critical. Coming out of 2018, we had a sort of windfall in expenditure reduction, so to speak, coming from the debt restructuring. We suspended principal payments for a while and interest payments are reduced. But when you look at the structure of expenditure, non-debt expenditure in Barbados, the structure hasn't really changed since 2018. And I think if we are to get to true debt sustainability, and to have the fiscal space to do some of the welfare things and the growth things, we have to address the structure of our non-debt expenditure. And I think that relates to things like the SOEs. What do we keep in the state sector? What are not? How are they funded? What is the business model for a number of these services? And if government can save money and generate efficiencies through private-public partnerships, reviewing its rentals, going a lot of that boring, non-headline grabbing, really looking in detail at the cost structures of what things you're doing and can you do this task in a much more efficient way. I think that's a critical part. And in some ways, I found that maybe the most disappointing part of the budget, because I think given the nature, and maybe it will come later, but given the critical nature of the SOE and that public expenditure reform to Bird 2, I was looking maybe for a little more beef, a little more detail on where we are going in those areas.
Okay.
It was
Were you
alluded
also
to, but we didn't get a lot of detail.
okay? Were you also looking for more details in that area, Peter?
Well, I wasn't looking for more detail, but I do agree that more detail would be entirely reasonable. I mean, one of the questions that's already coming up with some people that have been messaging me is whether or not the SOEs will benefit from this $1,500. I didn't hear anything in the Prime Minister's statement that suggested that they would, but certainly it seems that already people in the SOEs are lining up to understand whether or not they will benefit from it. These issues are challenging to deal with, though they're going to be very controversial. I mean, one of the SOEs is Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation, which has been one of the single major largest problems for government in terms of understanding where it's going with this. But I agree with Justin entirely that we need to look at the structure of these entities. We need to look at the way that they spend money if they're renting. We also need to look at whether or not they're doing anything that could be far more efficiently done otherwise. So the public role and the public purpose for which they're established, these are all things that we need to think about. I agree it's boring and not headline grabbing, but it can also be very controversial because there are people within these SOEs that earn a reasonably decent living and will not be happy to hear that their services or the entity may very well be terminated. And that is ultimately where we're going, because when you start to look at making these entities more efficient, invariably it will mean that some of the people who have fairly comfortable jobs may not continue to do so. And then there may be some political fallout where that's concerned. So that's going to be interesting. One that we haven't heard about is the airport and the partnership that's supposed to take that to another level. So definitely some details will be necessary. I didn't expect to hear them tonight, and hopefully maybe in the debate or in the future weeks we can begin to hear some of those details in a slightly more piecemeal fashion.
No, I'm glad we're on the issue of the SOEs, because the Prime Minister did say that there would be no massive set of layoffs coming in the public service, but some slight adjustments in that SOE sector. But what does adjustment really mean? Are we going to be doing a realigning of the budgets going to those entities? Are we going to be doing more crossing of those entities? Like, say, for example, the joining of the rural and the urban development commissions. We've already seen a situation where Kensington, the Sports Council, and the gymnasium are already together under one head, and continue to function. But what more can we really do with those state-owned enterprises, to make them profitable and to ensure that they are all fulfilling the purposes that they were designed for? Dr. Ram?
Well, I think we have come at that point where we do need to look at the state-owned enterprises in a very serious way. And there's a very easy framework for us to look at this, to look at each state-owned enterprises. We can look at whether or not they make profits and whether or not they provide a social benefit. If we were able to simply categorize every state-owned enterprise into that sort of, if I was to say, a Cartesian plane with profits on the y-axis and social benefits on the x-axis, we could simply say, okay, if a state-owned enterprise does not make any profit and it does not provide any social benefit, well, I think we have a clear idea as to what we need to do with it. If a state-owned enterprise makes profit and is really not providing much social benefit, but then we can consider privatizing that. And then, of course, we have those state-owned enterprises in the middle that are providing some profits and are also providing some level of social benefits. And we can think about whether we want to keep those fully as state-owned enterprises or perhaps consider some public-private partnership arrangement for them. I think that analysis really has to happen. And I think that the government has already begun looking at it. And so if we do that analysis, I think it's quite easy for us to then determine which of these state-owned enterprises we are going to keep, which we are going to privatize, and which perhaps we are going to use public-private partnerships to help us run it, to help us unlock some of the, I would say, asset values that are tied up in it. Now, Peter spoke about the airport. The airport is a good case in point. I mean, every time anyone leaves Barbados and perhaps goes to a metropolitan city, you can see how well airports are run in most places. And in fact, airports have become simply a shopping mall with a runway or 2 or 3 runways attached to it. This is the type of thing we have to start thinking about. Can we turn our state-owned enterprises into profitable ventures? And if we can't, if they are providing us with significant social benefits, well, then how do we make them much more efficient if we're going to keep them as full state-owned enterprises? These discussions have to happen, and I think the time has come for us to have those discussions, and that has to happen relatively soon. And I think the Prime Minister signaled that that type of discussion is about, and we're likely to see some shake-up and some movements within the state-owned enterprise sector in the near future.
Okay. Now, 2 other institutions that are clearly on the radar of everyone else would be the Barbados Water Authority and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And the Prime Minister spoke to some relief for the individuals who owe these institutions, some 25%, as long as the people pay between the 15th of March and the 15th of September. Is that time frame a little too long for us, Peter? Do you see Barbadians really coming forward and actually looking to pay up what they owe these institutions? Because what they do is critical to us. We know Barbados is very water scarce. We have some major investment with the Water Authority in terms of the 5 Cs projects and so on to help us in our augmentation programs. But are Barbadians really going to come out and pay what they owe?
Yeah. The water is a difficult question, and to be honest, I'm a bit surprised that QEH was included in that whole deal as well, because I think the QEH is a slightly different reality. But the water problem is challenging. You cannot take away people's water. It is a utility that government will probably have to provide to people one way or the other, whether or not they pay for it, because there are public health issues that come up. Government may threaten with disconnection and may do other things, but ultimately arrangements have to be made. No, I think that there are a number of people who are indebted to the Barbados Water Authority, and that debt has increased since COVID, since people were forced to, basically they were forced to extend longer lines of credit, and some people have racked up some major bills in that period of time. So it's useful that the initiative is being offered. As far as the timeline is concerned, I think, as long as you can afford to make it, to give people the opportunity to make good on those arrangements and to come clean. The challenge, I think, will be after that period of time is finished, and then you're still faced with substantial debt, substantial arrears. The Barbados Water Authority is in need of further income for developmental purposes and, the renewal of mains and so on. And the people who owe the Barbados Water Authority a lot of money. So they have to try to get what they can out of persons, and then the remainder, I don't know whether there will be some question of a write-off. As far as the QEH is concerned, I wasn't aware that the QEH debt was as significant in relation to people actually owing it money. Perhaps it is useful that the two have been twinned, and there can be some relief there, but I suspect the QEH is more an intention to start to see how some of the debts can be written off after a reasonable amnesty is offered.
Okay. Well, outside of the amnesty, though, the QEH is also in line for some major financial injection, some 139 million in total for its operations, 5.5 of that to be allocated to expand the A&E, and another 5 million to rehabilitate the Lions Eye Care Center, which, Peter, has been one of those sore points back and forth for a while. But nonetheless, we need to have the health care that the QEH is providing. A number of people are of the opinion that more of the services offered should be paid for by the citizens as opposed to being free, and that really and truly the only thing that should be coming free would be that emergency care. I see you nodding your head, Dr. Ram. Are you one of these believers that we should be paying more for health care, especially given that it is not the majority of our citizens who tend to have health insurance?
Yes, I mean, I would say that in general terms, we have to look at how we pay for this provision of welfare benefits, which I include healthcare as part of that. Now, I am also cognizant of the fact that you have persons within the society who might not be able to afford healthcare or insurance. And I think what we have to consider is how we target our interventions and our assistance towards those persons. And I think this must be a general framework that we look at to see how we can get the individuals in the population to contribute a bit more towards the provision of some of these welfare services. But in the instance where persons cannot afford to do that, then we provide extra and additional assistance to those persons rather than a sort of a blanket subsidy that we have sort of become familiar with. So I think we have to, I think over time, particularly as we look at our population, we have an aging population. And in fact, if we look out to 2100, we have a declining population as well. What are going to be the burdens with respect to the working class in having to support elderly and young people who are not yet in work? And so when we look at these things, we really need to have a discussion around how we pay for these welfare services and benefits. And I think we have to consider how we have more people contributing towards them. But where persons certainly cannot afford it, how we target our interventions and our assistance to those persons is going to be critical, I think, over the next few years for us to examine.
Okay. Now, Dr. Ram is speaking to the issue of those within the lower socioeconomic bracket. Peter and Professor Robinson, I want to look at how today's budget presentation is likely to impact on our middle class. Some people have been saying that most of the burdens now are being carried by that segment of our population. Are you in agreement, in disagreement, gentlemen?
Yeah. Well, I'll go first and then the economist can speak. But I didn't see a whole lot in it for the middle class, to be honest, in terms of relief. The middle class, middle income pensioners did receive some relief because they had a small increase in terms of their allowance. But there's not a whole lot else. One of the issues that has certainly been coming up on my program has been this whole question of the allowances that have been taken away from the middle class. And there's a feeling that there has not been an effort to restore a number of these allowances or something similar. And I think that has been a concern. But from my cursory perspective, I don't think that there was a lot in it for the middle classes. I see here a mention of nurses and some assistance in terms of travel. So there will be some nuanced initiatives like that. But to say that there was something which the middle income bracket could benefit from across the board, it didn't jump out at me as being obvious.
Okay. Professor Robinson?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Peter generally, but what I would say is the more futuristic growth initiatives, I think those are important as a source of new middle class jobs, new high paying jobs. And I think that's where I sort of started the program. I see that as the challenge that the Barbados economy is faced with now and has been faced with maybe for the last 20 more years, what some economists call this middle income trap, and really the inability to generate a lot of new middle class type jobs. So the initiatives in film and other areas. I think those are going to be quite critical if we're going to generate some better paying jobs. The construction is going to give us a fillip, and that's key, but that's not going to generate a lot of new sustainable high paying jobs. So those initiatives and that's why I sort of mentioned maybe that I was disappointed in not some more details on those, because I think those are going to be critical to really giving a new middle class fillip, because I don't know the government has a lot of fiscal space to be giving any sort of tax breaks to the middle class, but it's really these new growth opportunities. I mean, one of the things that I'm hopeful to see is that maybe even some of this SOE reform can be done in a way to create some new middle class opportunities through these private public partnerships.
Okay, now you were saying that it's not enough, but what about the holiday continuing on the electric vehicles? Isn't that going to help to service the middle class as well?
So, I mean, that's one aspect that we probably haven't spoken a lot. I mean, Barbados, the Prime Minister has emerged as a global champion in the whole climate crisis and adaptation. And the budget continues that trust of trying to build a green economy. And I think that's important. And I certainly commend the focus on that. I mean, that's been a consistent thing through through government policy. Yes, and that will continue, although many people in the middle class argue that electric vehicles are still sort of out of their reach, and that's more upper middle class initiative as distinct from really what you might call the middle class.
Okay, now I want to look at some of the other investment options that were raised in the budget. We're going to be seeing a major revamp of Bridgetown in the area of the Carinage, in the area of the Pierhead, going all the way up to Bay Street, which you were speaking about earlier, Peter, with the development that's going to happen in the area of the former geriatric hospital, well, the now geriatric hospital, soon to be former, I guess, within the next 24 months or so. Now, while this is development that is going to take place, it is also going to be significantly impacting commerce in and around Bridgetown, because it's going to impact on the traffic flow. And as we know, if a Barbadian cannot drive there and they have to walk too far, can't park to get it done, they're going to look to move away from that particular hub. So we might well see Warren, Six Roads, etc., getting the flow that would have ordinarily gone to Bridgetown. What are your thoughts on it, gentlemen?
Yeah, I have a concern and a reservation about traffic generally in Barbados. Justin is a Trinidadian, and I think that Trinidad probably knows more about traffic than most of the Caribbean countries. And I am concerned that especially the development along the South Coast is not being accompanied by some way of mass transit, moving people in large numbers from one point to the other. It cannot rely on motor vehicles because it will be messy. And I think that the two areas that have been identified, the Bridgetown area, there's some congestion issues there already that will get worse. The Warrens area, where I reside, is going to get a lot worse. And already there's some congestion areas in that center. And I do feel that part of this needs to be some kind of a traffic management plan, a mass transit facility, something that will allow those areas to develop. If government plans to put more office space in Warren's area, the Warren situation will become exacerbated. If we have more hotel activity, and technically speaking, we're looking at two, potentially three hotel installations in relation to that whole lower South Coast area. The problems and challenges continue. I believe the Prime Minister has thought about it. And I think that perhaps we could benefit from the expression of ideas in relation to how are we going to manage the movement of persons along those areas where you have essentially a two-lane highway, and the congestion and the potential for congestion is great.
Okay, we are actually coming toward the end, and I just want both Professor Robinson and Dr. Ram to respond to this last question which I have. What do you see as the strongest headwinds to Barbados's economic performance over the course of the balance of this year? Justin? Well, Dr. Ram.
Yeah, well, certainly the strongest headwinds is what's likely to happen in the global economy. It will be interesting to see what sort of negative impacts the recent financial, and whether that's going to spread and lead to some sort of a contagion with respect to economic activity there. I think for us as well in Barbados, we have to always pay particular attention to what's happening in the United Kingdom, because so many come from that particular country. So again, is the UK economy going to be strong, and therefore still have visitors coming from there? And then finally, I think the Prime Minister mentioned something about Guyana, Suriname, and regional initiatives. But I cannot emphasize enough how important the regional economy is still for the Barbados economy, not only in terms of visitors from other Caribbean countries, in particular from Trinidad and Tobago, but also in terms of how where it actually sources some of its imports as well. Okay. So I would say globally, US, UK, Caribbean region, we have to pay particular attention to those areas.
Okay, Professor Robinson, quickly.
Yes, and I would agree with all of those features from Dr. Ram. And what I would add on the domestic front is really project management and execution capacity. And I think governments have heard me say this year upon year. We have a public sector and a certain capacity. Many good projects, and the one or two big ones, and see them through to execution rather than trying to do 1,000,001 things that you're not getting done. So I think the project management execution on the domestic front.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. We have reached the end of our budget analysis for 2023. I want to thank the Pro Vice Chancellor for the Board of Undergraduate Studies at UWI, Professor Justin Robinson, Economist Dr. Justin Ram, who's gladly joined us from overseas, and political analyst Peter Wickham, who's also joined us from where he is to come and bring us this discussion this afternoon. The budget is gone. We can't change it, but we will continue to monitor, gentlemen, all of the developments, especially the investment ends and those things which are going to spur economic growth. I want to thank you, our audience, for tuning in this evening, and I wish you well as we go through the year and wait to see how these projects will improve Barbados's fortune. Thank you so much. I'm Wendy Burke.